Welcome to Leading from Being with hosts Marty Spiegelman and Todd Hoskins. Marty and Todd delve into untapped dimensions of leadership, weaving the possibilities within full consciousness and indigenous wisdom for enabling teams, organizations, and communities to thrive. Today they conclude their series on climate consciousness, welcoming author, professor, and regenerative farming advocate Liz Carlisle to talk about rooting and our relational exchanges with food, the land, and each other. Stick around for takeaways and our new segment, Potentialities, about rainmaking, lessons from a regenerating forest. Get show notes and much more at leadingfrombeing.com.
Hello and welcome to Leading from Being. My name's Marty Spiegelman and I'm here as always with my wonderful friend and colleague Todd Hoskins. Hey Todd, it's good to be together again.
Hello Marty, and hello to all of our listeners. We are thrilled to continue our series on climate consciousness. Marty, why don't you lead us into discussion today and introduce our special guest?
All right. So today I've been thinking of a famous Quero elder from the Andes, a wonderful fellow named Don Manuel Quispe. And I'm thinking of him because he always used to say, the closer you are to Pachamama, the better off you are. And in addition to that statement, just opening my heart every time I think of it, here's what we want to say before we dive into our big conversation today. In our Leading from Being climate series, we've been exploring connections between climate change and human consciousness, but so far mostly through a human lens. We've been looking at our decisions and actions and impacts as outcomes of the way we be within ourselves. Now, this is critical. It's a lens that we really need to use because one way or another, we have to understand much more deeply what our essential nature is as a species. And the premise here is that once we remember our true nature, we will remember to live our lives as an inextricable part of nature. But this is a big shift, and to be successful in this, we also have to remember another teaching from the elders. And this teaching is that everything in life is dependent on the principle of exchange. So think of humans and trees and the exchange of CO2 and O2. Or think of the journey of one water molecule through all the stages of the water cycle, changing and exchanging its own form to preserve its presence and function in the cycles of life. Without exchange, nothing flows, nothing grows, systems don't interact. Life, in fact, just stops. So just getting close to the land isn't enough. And what Don Manuel actually meant was we have to learn from the land. We can't keep going about our business making independent decisions. And what the land will teach us is this. Pachamama will teach us season by season what to give her so she can give us what we need in return, but only in ways that benefit the entire system. Now, when we humans developed agriculture, we essentially introduced new requirements for new types of exchange, meaning we introduced a demand on the big system that makes demands of us in return. And when we ignore this truth, when we just take and don't give back in a way that living systems require, those big living systems just correct themselves and not necessarily in our favor. So this is what we're seeing now in the land and the climate, large-scale natural systems resetting on their own behalf. But for us humans, Pachamama is always there, ready to speak to us if we'll listen, ready to teach us if we're willing to learn and participate. So today, we're using the lens of the land, not the lens of humans. We're inviting Pachamama, our Mother Earth, to take the lead and teach us how the larger systems of life actually work. And we'll listen and learn together as she reminds us how we actually fit in and what we need to know in order to fulfill our role with expertise and grace. and we'll let her show us the proper way to be closer to her. Now, to unfold this amazing conversation, we've invited one of the land's most brilliant voices, our very special guest today, Liz Carlisle. Liz is an associate professor in the Environmental Studies program at UC Santa Barbara, where she teaches courses on food and farming. Born and raised in Montana, she got hooked on agriculture while working as an aide to organic farmer and U.S. Senator John Tester. And this led to a decade of research and writing collaborations with farmers in her home state. Liz has written 3 books about regenerative farming and agroecology: Lentil Underground in 2015, followed by Grain by Grain in 2019 with co-author Bob Quinn, and most recently, Healing Grounds, Climate Justice and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming in 2022. Liz is also a frequent contributor to both academic journals and popular media outlets, focusing on food and farm policy, incentivizing soil health practices, and supporting new entry farmers. She holds a PhD in geography from UC Berkeley and a BA in folklore and mythology from Harvard University. And Liz, I love this part the most. Prior to your career as a writer and academic, you spent several years touring rural America as a country singer. And we all know Pachamama loves when we sing to her. So welcome, Liz. We're delighted to have you with us.
Oh, thank you, Marty. I'm delighted to be there. And I think what you said at the top was just so incredibly poignant. I'm still kind of sitting with it.
So we talk about the deep roots of regenerative farming. And Liz, I think you wanted to share some of your teachers before we get into the conversation that Marty has mapped out today. Who have you learned from?
Yeah, well, it is a long list. That could be the whole conversation. But I think, what's so amazing in the way that I do my research is I have the privilege of learning directly from farmers and indigenous communities and land workers. So everything that I share today is really what I've learned from these teachers. And maybe we'll get to speak a little bit more about 4 women in particular who I've learned a lot from recently through this most recent book project. Latrice Tatsey from Blackfeet Nation, who is a regenerative grazing expert, cattle rancher, buffalo restoration advocate, and Olivia Watkins, who is president of Black Farmer Fund and also stewards a forest farm in North Carolina that's been in her family for several generations. Aide Guzman, who is an agroecologist and also comes from a migrant farm worker background and a family that had a diversified small farm in Mexico. And Nikiko Masamoto, who is the 3rd generation to steward her family's farm in Delray, California, growing peaches and nectarines and apricots and raisin grapes. So these are 4 of my most important recent teachers.
That's a really beautiful cadre of elders to be working with. And I love that they're women because women in indigenous cultures lead the way. They teach everyone. They teach the boys and the girls. They teach the men and the other women. So to have women elders leading the way in this is really wonderful. And I love that you've put this at the front, Liz, that indigenous wisdom is not something for Western people to take and use a little bit of here and there. We are the ones who need to learn from the elders, the ones who have held this human wisdom and kept it steady for eons and eons. So I really, I'm very impressed with your work and just grateful for you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, really drawing on what you said at the top, so much of this work is about relationships and relationships of exchange and reciprocity that really are mutual. And if we want to do that on the land and with the land, we also have to figure out how to do that with each other. And we step in at a moment when hundreds of years of history have already created all this inequity. So as people devoted to healing, we have to think about how thoughtfully to enter in at this moment in history in a way that moves towards healing. So it is a lifelong journey about how we relate.
Yes, yeah, it's really beautiful. And that principle of exchange, it really speaks to what you just said, that this is in great part about relations and the relationship we make with one another, not just with the land. And our relationship with the wisdom keepers, with the elders, we need to invest in that relationship as much as we need to invest properly in soil practices and so on. And I'm thinking about a statement that you make in Healing Grounds, that soil can save us from climate catastrophe, but only if the global indigenous communities who originated soil stewardship practices lead the way. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the soil stewardship practices.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so excited that there's been recent widespread excitement about soil health and the idea that building up soil carbon is not only good for the fertility of lands that we grow food from, but also involves moving some of that carbon from the atmosphere back down into the soil. And, sometimes it can be a little discouraging when conversations about regenerative farming or soil health seem to kind of stop at the carbon molecule rather than all of the many things it is connected to. And I think, in speaking with these four women that I mentioned earlier, when they talked about what regeneration means in their communities, for example, Latrice, regenerative grazing, yeah, absolutely. It means managing both cattle and buffalo to mimic the historical patterns of buffalo across the landscape, where they graze heavily in an area, but then move on and don't come back until that vegetation has time to regrow. But there's a depth to it that's beyond just the kind of practice. There's all of the principles and the life ways that go with it about really respecting that the buffalo are a teacher, that they've had this long evolutionary history on the prairie, and that in observing their grazing behavior, that there's an opportunity for people to come into a more balanced relationship with that prairie and learn about how to make the most of what's available in a given season, and to build lives that are patterned on the rhythms of the land. So I think, in speaking with folks like Latrice or, folks like Ida Guzman, who's carrying all of these, longstanding indigenous practices that come from other parts of the Americas through her research and also her family background. There's the practice, there's the cover crop, for example, that you might plant in the off season to make sure there's roots in the ground all year round. And this isn't a crop for harvest, but a crop literally just to feed the soil and to keep the soil covered so there won't be erosion with winter rains or winds. But also, there might be a larger sense that that's part of giving back to land, and a ritual, a timing around it. So I think just this depth of being in relationship with land, of the level of observation and kind of intergenerational knowledge sharing that moves regeneration beyond these kind of individual practices that you might think of as kind of a checklist, to something more like the kind of sense of obligation that you might feel to a family member, that this is a relationship that will go on and on and on, for generations into the future, and that it's not about getting the most out of the land now or maximizing this crop, but it really is, you and the land in relationship forever. And imagining the flourishing of your own human family is deeply connected to the flourishing of all of these other beings that you're in relationship with, from the tiniest soil microbe, to the plant that you can see and touch and eat.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I just love how you said all of that. And I'm thinking about modern culture where gradually over the last 2,000 years or so, we have been separated from the land, and we have our own modern reasons for having become quite nomadic. And whenever people are separated from the land, they forget how to speak to the land and learn from the land. And I'm wondering if the elders you work with have insights or teachings that we could give our listeners to help them return to a sense of the land having meaning for them, even if they live in an apartment building. My sense is we need to reignite a sense of meaning. Why this matters? Why how we care for the prairies matters? Why how we grow actually matters?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there were sort of, for me, like two strands of inquiry as I was working on this Healing Grounds book. And one was talking to all these brilliant farmers and ecologists who are working to understand how carbon moves through soil and how through soil health we can move some of that carbon from the atmosphere back down into the soil profile. And so these conversations often were actually about roots and how important plant roots are in moving carbon back down into the soil and actually deep into the soil where it will associate with minerals and stay there. So you can put a lot of carbon back into the soil just by putting it on top of the ground, compost or mulch. But the carbon that comes through the plant roots is actually 5 times more likely to stay down in the soil and associate with minerals. So the ecologists just kept coming back to this theme of, roots in the ground all year round. If we really want to rebalance climate through land-based practices, that's what we need to do. And then my other strand of inquiry for this book was really trying to understand the history of agriculture on the North American continent for the past 500 years and how we got to this place of having a very extractive agriculture. And this is basically a history of uprooting people and the plants that they tend over and over and over again. Whether you're talking about slavery or you're talking about, the immigrant labor force that by and large does most of the agricultural labor in California, where I live in this day and age and has for several decades, or indigenous communities being pushed off of their land. So there's this tension between an ecology that requires rooting and a history that is all about uprooting. And so I think that it's about moving towards a way of being in relationship with each other and land that allows people to put down roots. And so I think we can all come to that from whatever place is most immediate for us. And so for some people, it's really coming from the history and lineage standpoint of knowing that, maybe your family has been in diaspora for a long time for reasons beyond, your family's control, and a kind of reclaiming of that lineage. There are folks, I think about the way that Leah Penniman from Soulfire Farm uses the term returning generation farmer. As a number of other people in the African American community and some other communities of color do, to reclaim that sense of like, yes, I come from a proud people with these incredible relationships to land. These were disrupted, and I'm reclaiming that. I've had students who've done these amazing cookbook projects, reclaiming cultural foods as pathways back to those relationships with land. Food is a way of maintaining that memory of connection to land, even as you say, if a family or a lineage has been forced to move around or, live in places where there's not that immediate access to grow a food, regardless of whether you get to grow all of the crops yourself, can be a way of remembering those relationships to plants and land. And then, for some of us, it comes more through that ecological path. For myself, I know when I was 24, very specifically getting very concerned about climate change and knowing my family had a background in agriculture. I came from an agricultural state. During my grandmother's time, our family lost our farm in the Dust Bowl, and thinking about how to be part of an agriculture that was part of repair of climate and land and ultimately all these social relationships too.
Well, I love this rooting and uprooting pairing. There's a term in Old Quechua from the Andes, sapichasca, and it means that a really well-matured human being has roots into the earth and grows like the tree of life. And so every person's life has rooting, and every person's life has a strong trunk that creates a canopy that creates flowers and seeds for the next season. And they traditionally would raise their children with this image of everyone is that tree of life and everyone is rooted. And I really love what you said. I think that for modern people, it's what I do with my students. I ask them to study the geology of the land where they were born and realize that they have those powers and capacities in them. They are that land and live that way because that puts roots down. And also, as you were talking about, really take a look at biological history and go back beyond the wars, before the big wars happened, and find out who your people were, because you have them in you. And then also there is the human lineage that we belong to. And I like to think of the human lineage because we're just another species in a big system that's got millions of species. And we're trying to remember how to participate in that. So, so your suggestions, well, also food, because I love food. These are wonderful ways to reconsider for our listeners, reconsider who you are and what your roots are, and see how that changes your sense of the earth and the land and what you buy to eat, and if you grow anything, how you grow it. Because these are really important. And I think, Liz, you haven't quite touched on this yet, but I keep thinking of the way vegetation, whatever is rooted in the land, creates and sustains weather patterns.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, plants are very powerful beings. I think, many of the great books of the past decade are about that. I'm a huge fan of Robin Wall Kimmerer's work. And I think you can spend a lifetime, studying, learning from the teachings of plants. And sometimes I think, we don't notice them as much as, I guess, creatures that have more in common with us, other mammals. They don't move as much, because they are rooted. But they do, they are placemakers. They are world makers. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from the ways that plants create the possibility for other life. They create conditions in which other lives can flourish. And, of course, some of them are around longer than we are, which is quite humbling. I've recently been particularly interested in the teachings of perennial plants and, what is required to survive, year after year after year, and shifting with seasons and taking different forms at different times of year in order to persist in that way. And the way in which, if you're going to be around for years and years and years, perennial plants tend to put a lot more of their energy into their roots, into the below ground parts of themselves, and the parts that are very much sort of sharing with other organisms that are almost, it's hard to tell where the plant ends and the rhizosphere begins. And so that makes me think about how, living a resilient life is often about the kind of quiet, unseen strengths. And very much that quiet, unseen strength is all about relationships with other beings, and not a sort of, just shoring up of individual strength or resources, that it's that kind of common resource, in the soil, in the case of perennial plants, that powers them through these epic lives.
Epic lives. I love that. And it's such a beautiful image. I hope our listeners are feeling into who and what they're connected to. And it doesn't have to be big, open, public collectivity. Just how do you settle into your lives and connect? Yeah, that's really something. Todd, you want to jump in here?
I do. And I've been a little distracted because we have a special additional guest who tried to join our podcast today. And then right as we were recording, a black-banded snake approached the door here and stuck its head up. And a black-banded snake, I will include a picture on the liner notes so that everyone can see how beautiful this snake is. It has stripes of magenta, and it eats millipedes.
Wow.
And helps regenerate the soil. And so I think that snake knew what we were talking about today and was saying, don't forget about me. I'm a part of it too. So I would like to go back to the word regenerative. I think for a lot of our listeners, they may have associations, but they don't know what it's actually about. And rather than offering a definition of regenerative, can you kind of dive into the essence of what regeneration and regenerative practices are for us, Liz?
Yeah. So I think about regeneration and regenerative practices in the context of agriculture. I know there are folks who think about it in other contexts too. But to me, regenerative agriculture is a way of raising food that gives back to land rather than taking from land. And so that's the real principle at the core of it. And a lot of the work is very specifically focused on giving back to the soil and in a sort of technical sense, increasing the amount of organic matter in the soil. That's just a really small part of soil by weight, but it's extremely important from the standpoint of soil function. So that's the part of soil that's either alive or formerly alive. So soil is a lot of rocks and air, but then a little bit of organic matter that makes all the magic happen, right? And so a regenerative agriculture that gives back to land through, keeping roots in the ground all year round, maybe through additions of compost, maybe these grazing practices that help those roots grow. That's going to add to organic matter in the soil. And that's going to allow the soil to do all these wonderful things, both for the farm itself and well beyond. So storing water for longer periods of time, which would help a farmer get through drought. Or also better water storage can help if it happens to be flooding, to be able to take that soil into the soil profile. But then, of course, we think about, well, if there's more carbon in the soil and that organic matter, that's a little bit less carbon in the atmosphere. All of this contributes to a healthier watershed, those kinds of things. So a lot of times the conversation can get boiled down to just, measuring carbon in the soil. But I like to come back to that bigger principle of farming in a way that gives back to land. Because that really orients us, I think, to the larger set of relationships and the sense that, a really good farm is basically mimicking the natural world and natural relationships between plants and animals and people and soil microbes.
There's too many limits in the public imagination right now about that principle being carried out because we are so used to extraction as being the norm. Without even using that term, that idea that the land exists to give us what we need, which is true, but it's not the full truth. And that relationships are there to provide safety and sustenance and to combat loneliness. And this idea that there's an exchange, an ongoing exchange that is core to regeneration and regenerative practices. I would love our listeners to think about outside of agriculture, how possible this is. When we talk about regenerative leadership, is it possible to create spaces for groups of people, for teams, for organizations, for communities? Is it possible to create spaces where the sum becomes more than just all of the parts put together, where there's actually energy created and there's new possibilities that exist because these people are in relationship, not just because they're sitting in a room together, but that they are in relationship. And when we're talking about in relationship and being in this exchange, it does not just mean exchanging air, exchanging space. It means that there is a connection there, that there is a respect for life, that you are a being, that you have unique gifts, you have something to offer, and I'm willing to accept those and offer my own. To be able to have that sort of felt experience for people, they can have that in nature. I think I've talked about on this podcast many times that my commitment to being outside and walking, regardless of the weather, every day, is partly to remind myself of the relational matrix in which I sit and how thriving it can be and how I am a part of it. I'm not just observing it, I am in it. For groups and teams and leaders who are gathering right now to try to make a difference in our world, I would like them to be able to believe that those spaces exist and that they can help create those spaces where the energy and the possibility and the potential is increased by that exchange.
Yeah. And Todd, what you're describing so beautifully, these are principles of consciousness that we've talked about on the podcast over the years. This is how consciousness left to its own devices actually works. That everything in a conscious living system is investing in everything else in the system in order to produce orders of magnitude more benefit for every part of the system and the extra energy to keep doing that over and over and over. And so when we talk about relationships, the three of us, we're talking about investment in relationship. And that's one of the principles. And the other principle is that investment creates extra energy. So that cycle of creativity, that cycle of creation can keep supporting itself. It just goes on and on and on and evolves as it does. And I wonder sometimes just the way English is being used in the modern world, if regenerative doesn't give people the wrong idea. It's like recycle. What if we talked about generative farming? Yeah, because nature, yes, nature recycles stuff, but I have this thing in my mind these days about getting people to think about new things that can be done without going back. Just the new thing that gets done. Just I have a metaphor about being the new grass in my wild meadow here, and nature doesn't stop to fix the old grass from last season. It just sends up new stuff. And right, and it's still grass, and it's growing on the history and the lives of the grass that's gone before, and it's growing on that root system. And I've been testing this metaphor out with my own students for a few years, and it seems to help people get this idea, which I know, Liz, you're working so beautifully toward, to help people understand that the living system is bigger than us, and we can literally work with the land and learn how it works, and we can use nature and agriculture and how the earth and the soil work as metaphors for our own human relationships and what we're growing in our very crowded world, just in human communities these days. Because consciousness is working the same way in all of these different ecologies and geographies. But I think that's important, that what nature is doing is constantly creating the next new cycle.
I think it's interesting to play with this word regeneration that has a lot of, it's kin to many other words. It's sort of, there are a lot of different concepts linked there. And Nikiko Masamoto, who I spoke with for Healing Grounds, what she pulls out of that word is generational. What's important to her is the sense of connection across generations and how you would farm differently if you feel a connection across generations, to humans and of course to others as well. The way in which that suggests a kind of long view, or, things that you would put into the soil, the kind of time and energy you would put into planting a tree. If you could think forward long enough to the whole life of that tree. She grows trees, so she thinks about this. I think why, regeneration is meaningful to me in the context of farming and agriculture. That the word sustainable was used for many years, starting in the 80s, with the idea of, let's try to farm in a way that will keep the resource going and not, diminish it. But I think what we've realized is that's not where we're at. The resource is already diminished. Many people are already farming on land that has less than 1% of this soil organic matter, like land that's not alive, basically. And so the challenge is, can we farm in a way that not only doesn't make things worse, but actually actively makes things better and that's engaged in repair? So we have this whole field of ecological restoration. Many of my colleagues work in it. And, historically, we've thought of it as something we do on, parks and natural landscapes, maybe places where people recreate. We need to do restoration on farms now. We need to grow food while we are also restoring ecosystems that have been damaged. And so I think that's where, regeneration comes in. And for me, as I sort of think about how history and ecology are linked, I also see it as repair of all the harm to people through these oppressive, extractive agricultural systems. And that a lot of that repair has to do with reconnecting people to land that was taken from them or resources that were taken from them. And so that's where, regeneration is meaningful to me. I do love the idea that, there's something creative or generative about sort of farming with life and farming with nature. And, I worry about sort of like the word new or senses of like the new, the novel, the innovative. because there are big corners of the regenerative agriculture conversation that have kind of disconnected from history. And as a result, I think have become pretty misguided in focusing more exclusively on carbon or a set of techniques or technologies without
Yeah.
really understanding the root causes of like why we have an extractive agriculture in the first place and what
Mhm.
it'll take to really kind of shift to a different way of being.
Yeah. Oh, it's all beautifully said. And what I'm feeling is your call to us is to be more dimensional about what agriculture is, what regenerative farming is, what it is to come awake in the time that we have and the work that we have to do. It's not just one thing, it's not just another thing, it's all of these things and all the different views and senses you have of these words. I just myself, I get concerned because people get stuck in one definition of a word, and what you've just done is you've blossomed your work like a big lotus blossom. And now we have multiple views of the deep meaning that you carry and that you bring to us. It's really beautiful.
I think it is really important to keep bringing language alive and not allow like a concept or a word to ossify and sort of lose meaning or stop kind of provoking new thoughts. Yeah. So I think opening up language and
Mhm.
inquiring of it is really helpful. And I think it is, I just keep coming back to going deep with our regenerative processes and what would it mean to really center food and land in our collective life as a society. That's what I think we need to do. Move to a more reciprocal relationship rather than extractive. But what that means is actually, yeah, taking seriously where our food comes from and the idea that that's a part of how we live, and maybe a parallel between the work that we all do that kind of connects what's going on in the field of leadership and what's going on in the field of agriculture is there's this kind of cult of efficiency, is like, how do we get it done faster and waste fewer resources, right? That seems to be a question that many people find interesting. And yet I think it's sort of cutting us off from the opposite thought is like, what if we really invested in the relationships in our agriculture or in our leadership in our workplace? Might that actually create more abundance, rather than this
Mhm.
kind of scarcity mindset of being, as efficient or really what that means is sort of like miserly with whatever like time and energy and resources we have. As opposed to imagining, a sort of sharing mindset that creates a collective abundance.
Exactly. And one of the big points you make is the importance of whatever we do being, as we say in English now, indigenous led. It is the elders who have the timeless wisdom of how these things work, and we need to be their good students. And I think listening to the elders, learning from them how the land speaks, learning how to invest in the land, learning where we humans come from, and learning about that moment when we invented agriculture and why we did it. All of this language, the language of the elders is clear. And I think our modern language, we can go off track really fast. But this is something that you do that is rare and priceless, is bringing forward the importance of indigenous-led projects, giving the elders space to teach us instead of running off with our own isolated new ideas. So it's really, really important.
I
Yeah.
love, Liz, that you are a scientist who has written a book with healing in the title.
Mhm.
And you've written about there are other food systems outside of our industrial food system. There are local food systems that are thriving. You have been with people and on the land of many people who are thriving in their exchange of food and roots and seeds and growth. And can you give us a sense of what it's like to be in those places that are not dominated by efficiency and industrial language and industrial methods, but those places where relationships are flourishing and people are flourishing? What does it feel like to be in those contexts?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think, to be perfectly honest with you, I think most of my experiences are a sort of combination of the beauty of that way of life and how hard it is in this current context. I think most places in the world, no matter how committed people are to this thriving local food system based on these principles of regeneration and healing and reciprocity, they're still contending with this global economy and food system that is making it hard to live that way. So I think there's often this mix of an experience of the difficulty of continuing to insist on that sort of food system. And, so many situations where in a family, one person is tending a traditional food system and another person is driving a long distance to have a job that has health insurance and will allow participation in a cash economy because the society has gone that direction. So I think there's a lot of this, which I think is also quite beautiful, this sort of survival work to just insist that these traditions will continue and that we'll have a memory of them as hopefully we collectively move into a way of being that is less extractive. I think one of the most brilliant distillations of what it feels like to be in a space like this is a book called Zapotec Science that was written almost 25 years ago now by an anthropologist who spent several years in a Zapotec village called Talea. And there were so many interesting things about this book. But one of the things that really stuck out to me is that there was no word for farmer. Everyone participated in the food system. And their term for it was mantenimiento, which, you could sort of loosely translate as maintenance, but it's so much more than that. It was like everyone contributing to the life of this place. And so whether you were the person that, stewarded the corn seed or the person that planted the corn or the person that made tortillas, whatever your role was, everyone assumed that they would be directly participating. And there was a kind of attention to the quality of work that we just do not see in the United States, where farming is something that like 1% to 2% of the population does. And farm work is something that people do who are at the bottom rungs of the social ladder. And there's not really an attention to what it feels like to do that work. The goal is to just get it over with, basically. But in this Zapotec village, every person had their tools crafted for them and actually tailored to their body, with the understanding that they were going to be using these tools for their whole life. And there were ways in which joy and music and culture were infused into everything. Even these really intense harvest periods with these long days, there was also a kind of festive element to it. And so I think just that idea that we would care about the quality of the experience of work in agriculture because we assume that everyone's engaged in it, and how just that sharing of the work can change its nature from something that feels exploitative and oppressive to something that's actually life-giving and valued.
Yeah, beautiful expression of how this knowledge is held in indigenous settings. And I'm wondering, I always wonder about scale. There are so many humans on the planet and so many people who actually have no access to land, really, found in cities. Do you have insights or wonderings or visions about solving this problem in a way that it reaches larger scale? Because we can take small communities, and your work is so beautiful, and people are learning and remembering. But to do that, as you were just describing, there's the Western economic system that forces us into activities that take us away from the land. Have you had any insights about how this vision of our required relationship with the land and the value of food and tending the land, how that spreads?
Yeah, I think there are really serious limitations to the degree to which a truly regenerative agriculture can be scaled up. That's a question I get a lot. But I think it can absolutely be scaled out, which is to say that I think we can have many such regional food systems where there's a balance between that ecoregion and the people who live there and the food system. So I think you're right that a really hyper local approach kind of falls on its face as you consider, well, what's possible within these 10 square miles, like, Los Angeles, for example, which is close to where I live.
Yeah.
But if you think more about, the region of Southern California, that's a different question. And so I think deeper connection within our regions and a kind of fashioning of the food system to really meet the needs of that region, both the human needs and the ecological needs, and then sort of, surplus going outside of that region. Whereas what we have now is the thing that's centered in the design of the food system is the surplus to be exported. And then the kind of afterthought is whether there's going to be any local food for people to like, a little bit of stuff for the farmer's market and that kind of thing. That's so visible where I live that, the prime agricultural land within an hour of me is all about exporting strawberries all over the country and in some cases other countries. And meanwhile, so many of the people that work in those strawberry fields do not have food to put on their own families' tables. And that's crazy, especially when you consider, the incredible longstanding traditions that Native folks in, the northeastern part of the United States have with strawberries that have been disrupted by the fact that all the strawberries are coming from California, so you see fewer local strawberries being grown that would be so much more delicious and fresh and actually managed as perennials. So I think the way to scale out a regenerative approach to agriculture is to focus on regional food systems that are designed to mimic the ecosystems of that region and meet the ecological needs of that region, as well as the human needs of those regions. And I do think it makes sense to have systems at national and maybe even international levels to support those things. Farm to school dollars, for example, is great national policy to support these regional food systems. So, districts would have more money per student to use that money to go out and procure really healthy, local, ecologically raised food that all the young people in the community can access through schools. So I think there's ways that these larger governance systems at, national or international levels can provide support to regional food systems. But I think we definitely need to get away from the idea of such a sort of commodity export way of thinking about growing food and utilizing agricultural land.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. In nature, that's what nature does. It doesn't grow a system larger than it can support, larger than can thrive. And then systems relate to systems and groups of systems relate to groups of systems. And so you've just described a way for humans to be like conscious nature is. That's very hopeful. Thank you for that.
Got to keep it hopeful. Yeah.
Yeah, really. Yeah. Yeah.
Or my classroom will just be a place of darkness and despair.
Right. No, we can't have that.
One last question for you, Liz. In our series on climate consciousness, this is the fourth and final episode. I think people have tuned in because they're curious about how do I bring together this idea of consciousness at work and the climate emergency that we are in.
You are on the front lines. How we have been approaching food has actually done harm to our planet, our relationship with the planet. But you are pointing a way towards there's a way we can do food that actually heals and restores our relationship with the planet and could reverse cycles of destruction. I'm curious for all of those who are not tending land or directly in the food system, how can they be part of that healing?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, so many ways to participate in the healing of the planet. I do think about, ways that are connected to our food system. And it could be, growing food at a very small scale in a community garden. I think there is really something about rekindling those relationships with the living world in ways that connect to what you eat at any kind of scale. There's wonderful community supported agriculture operations where you can essentially become a subscriber to a farm, which is also a way to deepen those relationships. Or, you might meet somebody at a farmer's market that helps you kind of connect more to where your food comes from. But I also like the ways in which we kind of stand up as community members. That's another really wonderful way to help with climate change and reconnect with the living world is to, stand up on behalf of the living world. And maybe that looks like advocating for more ecological procurement at a school or a faith community or a workplace or a hospital, some kind of institution you're connected to. Plugging in to some kind of local or regional group that cares about these issues. And they might get you to submit a public comment or show up for a volunteer workday. So many different things depending on, your gifts and your interests and where, what you're looking for in your life right now might meet what your community and what the earth really needs right now.
Beautiful. That's really beautiful. The earth gives us what we need to thrive, and we need to give back to her. Yeah. And so standing up like that, that's a very, very good idea.
Okay, I think we have reached the end of our time together, which means it's time for our closing segments.
Yes, and we have a new one, thanks to Todd. It's called Potentialities. And so, Todd, thank you for taking the lead in revitalizing our special segments. And it seems more important than ever for all of us now to focus on potentialities, our potential to be better, our potential to have relationship with the earth again and better relationship with one another. So much potential that we have. So, Todd, lead us into this new territory.
For the last 5 years, we have featured a segment on leading from being called Conscious Rant. It was a means of directing our attention to what is breaking the world or what needs to stop. We no longer feel like this segment is serving us or our listeners. As Marti has said, to really be who we are, we must learn to focus on what works, what might be possible, even call in what has never been known before, to forget about probability and even possibility, instead manifest the seemingly impossible. Why not? It's our way as humans. If all we do is rant, complaining and judging and negating one another in a constant battle to win or control things, we push ourselves into limited consciousness where all we have is negativity, separation, and collective illness. There is a place for expressing frustration, anger, or even rage. I hope we can all find spaces to metaphorically or literally pound our fists against the ground. Perhaps under a big tree, she will understand. But these emotions must be allowed to move through us, not be circulating endlessly and paralyzing our imaginations. So beginning today, we are starting a new segment, Potentialities. This segment will replace the conscious rant as well as From the Edge, as our commitment to sensing what is possible in a world that desperately needs to feel the potential for thriving.
Potentialities. Potentialities.
For the past week, I've been witnessing something remarkable here in Costa Rica's tropical dry forest. While the radar shows no rain in the vicinity and the nearby town remains dry, our little pocket of jungle has been receiving steady rain for a week. It's as if the forest itself is orchestrating its own weather. This living laboratory has shown me firsthand what scientists call microclimate precipitation zones. Our forest is quite literally generating its own rain through an intricate dance between trees, soil, and sky. The diverse canopy above me releases moisture through evapotranspiration. As Marti referenced in the introduction, everything in life is dependent upon the principle of exchange. How is this happening here and not a kilometer away? This pocket of forest where I live was clear-cut more than 50 years ago to make way for cattle grazing, a practice that has occurred and continues to occur across the tropics and the globe. But over 30 years ago, research was done on native plants and trees for this bioregion. Water conservation and soil building were done, tens of thousands of trees were planted, and now it is a haven for plants, wildlife, insects, and water cycles. The dry forest typically faces months of drought, where most trees shed their leaves and life seems to pause. But these microclimate zones, these pockets of extended rain, create crucial buffer periods. They extend the growing season, allowing plants to store more nutrients and water before the long dry spell. We've quoted Janine Benyus many times on this show. Life creates conditions conducive to life. Appropriate planting and care leads to more water, which leads to more plants, which leads to more water and life. You get the idea. This is how desertification ends. This is how our planet heals herself. When we plant only teak trees or impose singular or simple solutions, we miss the profound intelligence at work here. True regeneration emerges from a state of deep listening and presence, of consciousness. There are principles that guide this process. Our state of being shapes our actions. When we approach the land with reverence and open awareness, we become attuned to its rhythms and needs. Context is everything. Each pocket of forest, each microclimate has its own character and requirements. Universal solutions probably won't succeed. We can pay attention to the insects, the flows of water, alongside excellent research from people like Liz Carlisle. And finally, diversity builds resilience. Just as this forest thrives through its varied species, each playing its unique role in water retention and distribution, our solutions must embrace complexity and interconnection. Let's think about what this means for leadership. Just as this forest creates its own sustaining cycles through diversity and interconnection, our organizations, our communities thrive when we create the spaces for varied perspectives and skills, ways of seeing life, ways of living. When leaders operate from a state of presence and deep listening, a full consciousness rather than reactivity or rigid control, we create conditions where creativity and resilience naturally emerge. Like these microclimate zones that extend life-giving rain, consciousness in leadership extends the seasons of growth and adaptation in our teams and organizations. This isn't about imposing change from above, but about creating the conditions where sustainable transformation can take root and flourish. Our most powerful actions arise not from imposing our will, but from aligning ourselves with life.
Oh, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Absolutely beautiful. I like our new potentialities. That's really, really great. Thank you. And now I think it's time for takeaways, right? All right. Well, I have two takeaways, and one that just thrilled me was roots in the ground all year round. It thrills me for my wild meadow. It thrills me for people. Root yourselves. Put some roots down somewhere. It's really, really important. And the other thing, Liz, that just lit me up totally, and I might be quoting this slightly differently than the way you said it, but you said a good farm mimics the ecosystem that it's in. I hope I'm close with that. Yes.
Bingo.
And yeah, what I heard was instead of plopping ourselves down on top of Pachamama's belly and taking stuff, we weave ourselves in for thriving. We have to become part of the bigger thing. It was so beautiful. Just so beautiful. Wow, Liz, thank you so much. I'm just all lit up for the year, for the next year.
Beautifully stated about the weaving in. I think that's just it.
That's great. Todd, what's your takeaway?
Well, it really started with Liz talking about her teachers at the beginning, this sense that diversity creates conditions for life to flourish. And I am just thinking about agroforestry and all the different ways that the land thrives when people tend to all of its intricacies and notice what's different and what works. And I feel like, Liz, you are just a healer, a scientific healer, and I'm thrilled that you are with us today and doing the work that you are doing.
Mhm.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, this is such a nourishing and healing conversation. Really glad to get to share this dialogue with you both.
That's
Well,
great.
speaking of the dialogue, you get to offer a takeaway as well for our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, I was just so struck in hearing you all reflect on the work that you do around leadership and what regeneration might mean in the context of leadership. That, human beings are not so different from our brothers and sisters in the natural world in terms of what gives us life, how we function, and how we sort of reach our potential. That there are so many parallels when you think about what makes sense for a plant or the soil, and what makes sense for people. So it's redoubled my commitment to seek answers for my own life in the natural world around me.
Beautiful. That's wonderful. We love your energy and your brilliant work, Liz. Thank you so much for an extraordinary exploration today. We are really appreciative that you are with us. And Todd, thank you as always. And thank you to our listeners for joining us today here at Leading from Being. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Until next time, thank you, Liz. Thank you, Marty. Thank you, listeners.
You came up from the ground, from a million little pieces. You're a pretty human being. Yeah, you're a pretty human being. When it all comes crashing down, try to understand your meaning. No one said it would be easy. This living it ain't easy. And you were sewn together with a tapestry of molecules, a billion baby galaxies and wide open spaces. And everything you need is here, everything you fear is here, and it's holding you up. It just keeps holding you up.
Thank you for listening to Leading from Being. You can learn more at leadingfrombeing.com, including contact information for Marty and Todd. Our theme song is courtesy of Cloud Cult.